Different kinds of obligation. Classification of obligations, there are two. Primary classification of obligation under the Civil Code, pure and conditional obligations, obligations with a period, alternative and facultative obligations, joint and solidary obligations, divisible and indivisible obligations, obligations with a penal clause. For the purposes of this video lecture, I will divide the video lecture into two. The first part will be pure and conditional obligations, obligations with a period, and lastly, alternative and facultative obligations. For the second part of this video lecture, joint and solidary obligations, divisible and indivisible obligations, obligations with a penal clause. Now, first, pure and conditional obligations. Define pure obligations. When we speak of pure obligations, we look at Article 1179. According to Article 1179, every obligation whose performance does not depend upon a future or uncertain event or upon a past event unknown to the parties, it is demandable at once. Every obligation which contain a resolutory condition shall also be demandable without prejudice to the effects of the happening of the event. According to Article 1179, na-define na rito yung dalawang klase ng obligations. These are pure and conditional obligations. Pag sinabi niyong pure obligations, it is not subject to any condition and no specific date for its fulfillment. Thus, it is immediately demandable. Okay? Pag sinabi nyo namang conditional obligations, these are subject to, one way or the other, to the fulfillment of a condition. Okay? Simple example of pure obligation, Darwin obliges himself to pay Carlo 1,000 pesos. Simply demandable kaagad because the obligation is simple. Obliges himself to pay Carlo. Walang date, walang condition. So that is pure obligation. Okay? On the other hand, when we speak of conditional obligations, meron tong fulfillment of a condition. Pero of course, bago natin muna bigyan ng example, ano ba yung ibig sabihin ng condition? When we speak of condition, it is a future and uncertain event upon the happening of which the effectivity or extinguishment of an obligation subject to it depends. Okay? Future and uncertain event. So, ano ba yung mga characteristics ng isang condition? It should be future and uncertain. That's the number one characteristic. In order to constitute an event as a condition, it is not enough that it be future. It must also be uncertain. Kaya nga end eh. Diba? Future and uncertain. Hindi lang sinasabing future. Dapat uncertain. Example, pag nakapasa sa CPA board exam, pag nakapasa sa Law 1, pag nakapasa sa midterm exam, pag nakapasa sa final exam, pag sinagot ni Maria, diba? It's future, pero uncertain. Ibig sabihin, hindi tayo sure. Hindi ka sure. Eh, sir, paano yung mga past? Pwede po ba siya maging condition? It can. Okay? That is the second characteristics of a condition. However, when we speak of a past event, it should be unknown. Dapat unknown to the parties. Kahit na ito ay past, dapat unknown yung event na yon. Okay? Kailan namatay si Jose Rizal? Maaring dalawang tao nag-uusap, hindi nila alam kung kailan namatay si Jose Rizal. So that is considered an unknown past event. Okay? So now, hindi lang basta-basta ang condition. There are two principal kinds of condition. Yung tinatawag nating suspensive condition and resolutory condition. So ano ba yung suspensive condition? When we speak of suspensive condition, it is a condition precedent or condition antecedent or one the fulfillment of which will give rise to an obligation. Okay? Bibigay tayo ng example para for you to understand it clearly. I will give you a Toyota Corolla pag ikaw ay nakapasa ng CPA board exam. Okay, ulitin ko ha. I will give you let us be specific. I will give you my 2010 Toyota Corolla with plate number MEN 845 upon passing the board exam. Okay? So, ano yung suspensive condition? The passing of the board exam. Suspensive siya kasi hindi pa naman nangyayari. So, it is still future and uncertain. Ano ang obligasyon? I will give you my Toyota Corolla with plate number MEN 845. Okay? So, the condition is future and uncertain. So, that is suspensive condition. Hindi pa siya nangyayari. Ano naman ang resolutory condition? Dito madalas nalilito class sa resolutory condition. Ano ba ibig sabihin nito? Ito yung mga condition subsequent or one the fulfillment of which will extinguish an obligation already existing. Okay? Ano ang example para mas maintindihan nyo? I will be giving you your allowance from today until you graduate next year. Okay? Ulitin ko ha. I will be giving you your allowance of, lagyan natin ng presyo, kunyari, 100 pesos per day until you graduate next year. March 2023. Okay? Ano yung obligation? Binibigyan ka ng allowance ng 100 pesos. Anong condition? Pagdating ng March 2023, pag-graduate mo. Okay? So, in this scenario, the obligation now is extinguished upon the happening of the graduation in March 2023. Ibig sabihin, binibigay na yung obligasyon sa iyo. Nasa iyo na yung obligasyon. So, yung resolutory condition nandun, pag nangyari yun, tigil na. Extinguish na yung obligasyon. Okay? So, ganun lang kasimple, class. Okay? Yung resolutory. Nakakalito lang, but the obligation is already existing. Ito ay may extinguish pagdating ng condition. Eh, paano, sir, pag hindi graduate? Then, that's the question. Okay? Eh, di syempre, depende yun sa agreement ulit. Pero usually, pag sinabing, pag graduate ka, at hindi mo naman sinabi ng March 2023, pwedeng tumigil o ituloy ang iyong obligasyon. Okay? Now, ano bang distinction between suspensive and resolutory condition para mas maintindihan pa natin lalo? In suspensive condition, pag ito ay fulfilled, the obligation arises. Kaya nga na sinasabi na, it gives rise to an obligation if the condition is fulfilled. However, if the resolutory condition is fulfilled, dito naman, the obligation is extinguished. And sa suspensive condition, if the condition did not take place, the tie of the law does not appear. Siyempre, yung juridical tie, di ba? Siyempre, pag hindi nangyari yung ating condition, hindi ka nakapasa, edi wala akong legal tie, wala akong obligasyon sa'yo. On the other hand, pag hindi naman nangyari, hindi nangyari ang resolutory consolidated na-consolidate na, nangyari na, nagbibigay na ako ng allowance. So, again, with the example, it's either ituloy ko yung aking obligasyon or hindi. Depende on the condition. Well, the condition, pwedeng ituloy kung usapan is graduation. Pero kung graduate ka o hindi, pagdating ng March 22, ano ka na? Stop na ang iyong allowance. When obligation is demandable at once. When the obligation is pure, again, demandable at once yan. Wala nang kwento-kwento. Pwede mo nang i-demand kaagad ng obligation. Number 2 and 3, it may either be because there is a resolutory condition attached to it or resolutory period. Pag dumating na yung period, gaya nga na sa example ko, March 2023, pag dumating, stop na ang obligasyon ko. Ano yung condition? Stop na rin or demandable na kagad to stop the obligation pagdating ng graduation mo ng March 2023. Okay? That is when the obligation is demandable at once. Ano yung mga important reminders natin? Ang sinasabi lang dito is that yung past events class, it is what is really contemplated by law is the knowledge to be acquired in the future of a past event, which is at the moment is unknown to the parties interested, for it is only in that sense that the event can be deemed uncertain. Diba? Sabi ko nga, ang importante dyan is unknown to the knowledge of both parties who are part or who are privy to the obligation. Okay? Kung alam ng isa, ay hindi na siya unknown. Hindi na siya past events unknown to the parties. Next, where duration of period depends upon the will of the debtor. A period is a future and certain event upon the arrival of which obligation is subject to either arises or is extinguishes. The debtor promises to pay when his means permit him to do. Yung ganyan, ang pinag-uusapan lang natin dito, class, is that there is a period. Hindi lang clear. Pero, ang usapan na magbayad, hindi na kini-question yun. Ang pinag-uusapan lang dito ay kailan magbabayad. Pag ang duration ng period depends upon the will of the debtor. Tandaan nyo, class, hindi pinag-uusapan kung magbabayad o hindi. Dahil magbabayad. Ang tanong ay kung kailan. So, that is will of the debtor. Okay? Ano yung mga classification of condition? Ito yung mga tinatawag nating potestative or casual or mix. Pag sinabi nyong potestative, a condition suspensive in nature and which depends upon the sole will of one of the contracting parties. Ito yung tinatawag nating potestative condition. Ibig sabihin, will of the debtor. Okay, sole will ng isa sa mga, sole will of either debtor or creditor. Okay? Yan yung mga tawag lang naman para mas maintindihan nyo. Pag sinabi nyong casual, ito naman yung mga klase ng condition na it depends upon a chance or upon the will of a third person. The obligation is subject to its validity. Example, sabi ni Sam, he binds himself to sell his land to B if he wins or if Pure Foods wins. Yan. If Pure Foods wins the championship. Sample, ha? Sabi ni Sam, bibenta ko sa iyo yung lupa. Bert, bibenta ko sa iyo yung lupa. Kung magcha-champion ang Pure Foods. May Pure Foods ba ngayon? Ano ba mga Hinebra na lang. Kung magcha-champion ang Hinebra, ibibenta ko sa iyo ang lupa. So, casual, it is, the condition is dependent upon a chance. Okay? Ano yung other party? Pwedeng Sige, pag dumating si Xavier. Yan. Pag dumating si Xavier, ibebenta ko sa yung lupa. Kung di dumating, syempre, hindi ko ibebenta sa yung lupa. Pero pag dumating, ibebenta ko sa yung lupa. That is the will of a third person. Pag sinabi mong mixed, the obligation is valid if the suspensive condition depends partly upon a chance or partly upon the will of third person. Okay? So, yan yung tinatawag naman natin na mixed. So, potestative, casual, and mixed. Ano ang possible? When we speak of possible, of course, it is physically possible or legally possible. Pwedeng mangyari ang isang bagay. Pero pag impossible, ito naman yung imposible. Siyempre, imposible o legally or physically impossible. Ano ba mga example na lang muna para mas maintindihan nyo? Pag sinabi nyo physically impossible conditions, halimbawa sinabi ko, I will pay you 10,000 if it will not rain for 1 year in the Philippines. O, syempre, imposible naman yun. Alam nyo naman ang Pilipinas. Parati na umuulan. Most of the time, tag-ulan nga sa atin. So, that is an impossible condition. O, legally possible. Ano ba? Si Sam will give Berto if Berto will kill if Berto will kill Carlo. Sam will give 1,000 to Berto if he will kill ano nga sabi ko? If he will kill Carlo. Okay? Again, killing is against the law. So, it is impossible. Okay? Impossible, madali lang yon. Siyempre, yun yung mga posible. Pero pag impossible, we discuss the impossibility because you cannot put a condition if it is impossible. Okay? Positive and negative. When we speak of positive and negative conditions, ito yung mga tinatawag naman natin na kondisyon. Pag sinabi mong positive, syempre, ito yung positive to do things. You will do things. Okay? The condition that some event happen at a determined here, the obligation is as soon as the time expires or it has become indubitable that the event will not take place. Okay? Pag sinabi mo namang negative, this is a condition that some event will not happen. Hindi na talaga mangyayari. Okay? Positive, posibleng mangyari. Negative, hindi na talaga mangyayari. Pag divisible and indivisible, when we speak of divisible, it is that kind of condition where the divisible is capable of partial performance. On the other hand, when we speak of indivisible, it is not capable of partial performance by the nature or by law or by the agreement of parties. Okay? Ano ba yung mga pwedeng nating magandang example ng posible, ng divisible at indivisible? Okay? When we speak of divisible or indivisible, example, si Darwin is to give Carlo a car if Carlo finishes his law course, and 1 million if Carlo tops the bar exam. Wow. Okay, yun ang magandang example. Darwin is to give Carlo a car if he finishes his law course, and if he tops the bar, he will be given a 1 million. So divisible siya dahil kung pumasa siya, pwede na siya makakuha ng kotse. At pag nakatapos ng law at kung nakapasa pa at nag-top sa bar exam, 1 million. So that is divisible. So dalawa. So paano pag indivisible? Darwin is to give Carlo a car if Carlo finishes his law course and tops the bar. So, hindi pa pwedeng nakatapos ka lang. Dapat mag-top ka pa. And, okay? So, that is indivisible by nature. Now, moving forward, kung kayo man ay information overload, all you have to do is message me if you have questions. Next, effect of happening of a condition. Ano bang effect nun? Acquisition of rights and loss of rights already acquired. That is very simple. That is very basic. Diba? Pag nangyari yung condition, in suspensive, nag-acquire ka ng right. Or, pag resolutory, loss of rights already acquired. So, matatanggal na yung iyong obligation dahil nangyari na yung resolutory condition or resolutory period. Now, we move to important reminders. Article 1189 of the new Civil Code. Rules in case of loss, deterioration, and improvement of determinate thing before the fulfillment of the suspensive condition. Forgive my typo error. Suspensive condition yan, class. Una, we have to understand, ano ba yung concept ng loss? Pag sinabi yung concept of loss, a thing, okay? Pag sinabi dito na determinate thing, determinate thing ang pinag-uusapan natin dito. A thing is considered loss when it perishes or goes out of commerce or disappears in such a way that its existence is unknown or it cannot be recovered. Yun ang ibig sabihin ng loss. Tatlo. Okay. A determinate thing is loss if, una, if it perishes. Nasira, nabulok. Prutas, nabubulok. Gulay, nabubulok. So, it is considered loss if it perishes. Okay? If goes out of commerce. Ano yung kadalasan na goes out of commerce? Cellphone. Okay? Dati meron tayong tinatawag na 5110. Dahil out of commerce na siya, wala na pumapansin. It is now considered lost. Ano pa? Of course, yung common or basic knowledge about loss. When in such a way its existence is unknown or cannot be recovered. Pag hindi nyo na makita, ay obviously lost na yun. So, ano mangyayari? Ano mangyayari pag nawala yung object ng determinate thing? Yung object which is determinate thing. Ano mangyayari? What will happen? Pag nawala, without debtor's fault, kung hindi kasalanan ng debtor, the obligation is extinguished. No question about that. Yan yung tinatawag nating fortuitous event. Usually. Okay? Pag nawala, nang walang kasalanan ng debtor, obligation is extinguished. Pero kung may kasalanan ng debtor, the debtor shall pay the value of the determinate thing plus damages. Okay? Plus damages. Ngayon, kung nag-deteriorate naman yung determinate thing, sa kanina loss, nag-deteriorate. Pag walang kasalanan ng debtor, without debtor's fault, the impairment shall be borne by the creditor. So, si creditor ang mananagot kung wala namang kasalanan. Okay? Walang liability on the part of the debtor. Pero kung may kasalanan si debtor, dalawang aksyon na pwedeng gawin ng creditor pag may kasalanan si debtor. Una, pwede niyang i-rescission or i-rescind ang kontrata plus damages. Ibig sabihin, pwede niyang itigil na yung kontrata pero magabayad pa rin siya plus damages. Or, pwede rin siyang tuloy mo pa rin pero may damages pa rin. Okay? Yan yung konsepto ng deterioration na ang may kasalanan ay debtor or walang kasalanan. Paano naman kung nag-improve? Nag-improve. Diba? Nag-improve yung thing. Usually naman, pwede naman mag-improve yun. Okay? Sino ang magbe-benefit nun? Of course, by nature or by time, the improvement shall inure to the benefit of the creditor. Okay? So, sa creditor mapupunta pag nag-improve. Dahil kung mapapansin nyo, if there is loss or deterioration, usually, ang nagsasuffer yung creditor. Pero pag gumanda naman at naging maayos yung determinating, it will inure to the benefit of the creditor. Okay? So, this is pure and conditional obligation. Now, we move to obligation with a period. Ano bang meaning ng obligation with a period? When we speak of obligation with a period, it is one whose effects or consequences are subjected in one way or another to the expiration or arrival of said period or term. Okay? Ulitin ko ha, ang obligation with a period is one whose effects or consequences are subjected in one way or another to the expiration or arrival of a period or term. So, ano muna ibig sabihin ng period or term? Pag sinabi mong period or term is a future and certain event, upon the arrival of which the obligation subject to either arises or is terminated. It is a day certain which necessarily come, although it may not be known when. Example, death. Sure na mangyayari at sure na mamamatay. Diba? Lahat naman tayo mamamatay. Next is, ano ba mag-next? As sure as the sun will rise tomorrow. Meron mga sinasabing ang araw ay siguradong sisikat bukas. No doubt. Diba? Talagang kahit anong gawin natin, sisikat ang araw. Hindi na pwedeng questionin. So, anong difference ng period or condition? Siyempre, una, as to fulfillment, a period is a certain event which must happen sooner or later, at a date known beforehand or at a time which cannot be determined, while a condition is uncertain event. Okay? As to fulfillment, ang period certain. Ang condition, uncertain. As to time, a period refers only to the future, while condition may refer also to the past event unknown to the parties. Okay? As to influence on the obligation, a period merely fixes the time for the efficaciousness of the obligation. If suspensive, it can prevent the birth of the obligation in due time. If resolutory, it does not invalidate the fact that the obligation existed. On the other hand, a condition causes an obligation either to arise or to cease. Okay? Ang period, nag-fix lang yan ng time. Hindi kagaya ng condition, it causes an obligation to arise or to cease. As to effect, when left to the debtor's will, a period which depends upon the will of the debtor empowers the court to fix the duration thereof. Pag iniwan mo ang period sa debtor's will, the court shall fix it. That's according to 1197, paragraph 2 of the New Civil Code. While a condition which depends upon the sole will of the debtor, the obligation is invalid. Hindi pa pwede ang condition, sabihin ng debtor, bayaran kita kung kailan ko gusto. Hindi pa pwede yun. Okay? Debtor's will, hindi pa pwede. Period, pwede. Okay? Bayaran kita as soon as babayaran kita pagdating ng panahon. O, yun. Pag walang ganon, ay bahala ng court na mag-ayos doon. Basta sure tayong magbabayad. Ang masakit lang dito, kung hindi magbabayad. As to retroactivity of effects, unless there is an agreement to the contrary, the arrival of the period does not have any retroactivity, while the happening of a condition has retroactive effect. Okay? Anong example? Anong example ng retroactivity effect? Ang period, wala na. Pag dumating yun, wala na. That's it. Hindi gaya ng condition. Pag nangyari yung condition, it has an ibig sabihin, the obligation will have a retroactive effect. Okay? Now, ano-ano pa? Ano ba yung mga kinds of period or terms according to effect? Ito yung tinatawag nating XJ or INDM. Okay? When we speak of XJ, ito yung suspensive period. Suspensive period or yung ating indiem is the resolutory period. The obligation begins only from the day certain upon the arrival of the period. Okay? Yung XJ, pag dumating yung period na yon. Okay? It gives rise. Yung obligation begins. Pag indiem, the obligation is valid up to the day certain and terminates upon arrival of the period. And that is indiem. According to source, it may be legal period, conventional period, or judicial period. Pag sinabi mong legal period, when it is provided by law. Pag sinabi mong conventional or voluntary period, when it is agreed by parties. Judicial period, when it is fixed by court. Sinabi ko naman kanina yan. Pwedeng i-fix ng court if it is upon the will of the debtor. Pag legal period, sinabi ng batas. May batas na nagsasabi na ikaw ay dapat may obligasyon sa ganitong panahon. Okay? According to definiteness, pwede siyang definite period or indefinite period. Definite period when it is fixed or it is known when it will come. Indefinite when it is not fixed or it is not known when it will come, where the period is not fixed but a period is intended. The courts are usually empowered by law to fix the same. So, hindi kasi pwede ang indefinite period. Okay? Dapat parating definite. Okay. Presumption as to benefit of a period. Siyempre, the presumption is, yun ang tatandaan nyo. Ang presumption nito is for benefit of both parties. Creditor and debtor. Kaya nga ito ginawa. The presumption is for the benefit of both parties. Of course, pag sinabi mong both parties, merong exception. The presumption, of course, is rebuttable. Okay? It means that before the expiration of the period, the debtor may not fulfill the obligation and neither may the creditor demand its fulfillment without the consent of the other, especially if the latter would be prejudiced or inconvenienced thereby. Okay? So, yan ang ano natin. Yan ang pinaka-idea. Okay? But however, there is an exception to the general rule. The tenor of the obligation or the circumstances may, however, show that it was the intention of the parties to constitute the period for the benefit of either the debtor or the creditor. The benefit of the period may be the subject of express stipulation of the parties. So, pwede. That is an exception. Term is for the benefit of the debtor alone. Pag sinabi mong benefit ng debtor alone, he cannot be compelled to pay prematurely. But he can if he desires to do so. Halimbawa, si Darwin borrowed from Carlo 1,000 pesos to be paid within 1 year without interest. Okay? In this case, the period of 1 year should be deemed intended to benefit Darwin only. Therefore, he can pay any time but he cannot be compelled to pay interest or he cannot be compelled to pay before the 1 year. Okay? So, pwede yun. Exception yun. And, pwede rin na yung term is for the benefit of the creditor. He may demand fulfillment even before the arrival of the term, but the debtor cannot require him to accept payment before the expiration of the stipulated period. Okay? Pwede na pag pinag-usapan, itong period na to, magbayad ka, pwede niya refuse yung, kasi it is for his benefit. Kaya finix ang period na yun. Example, Darwin borrowed from Carlo 1,000 pesos payable in or payable on December 31. Na merong usapan that Darwin cannot make payment before the lapse of the period, but Carlo may demand fulfillment even before the said date. Here, si Carlo can demand payment at any time, but Darwin cannot shorten the 1 year period without the consent of Carlo. Ordinarily, there must be an agreement granting the benefit of the term to only the creditor. Hindi ka pwede magbayad kasi baka naman si creditor kaya niya dinelay, gagamitin niya yung pera next year pa, sa December niya sa December niya gagamitin yung pera. Okay? So that is considered. So, presumption for both. Pero exception, pwedeng either debtor or creditor. Paano natin kino-compute? Okay? Paano natin kino-compute ang term or period? When we speak of year, it shall be understood to be 12 calendar months. Tandaan nyo pag sinabing year, 12 calendar months. Tandaan nyo yan. Pag isang taon, 12 calendar months. Pag sinabi nyong month, 30 days. Pag hindi specific, class, unless sinabing February, 28 yon. Pero pag hindi sinabi, isang buwan, magbibilang ka ng 30 days. Trick question yon, class. So you have to remember. Pag sinabing years, 12 months. Pag sinabing months, 30 days, unless specific. Okay? And, ano ba? And of course, day is 24 hours. And pag sinabi mong night, from sunset to sunrise. Okay? Pag sinabi mong one day, dapat to 24 hours. Pag sinabi mong gabi, sunset to sunrise. Okay? Okay, a calendar month is a month designated in the calendar without regard to the number of days it may contain. It is the period of time running from the beginning of a certain numbered day up to, but not if there is a not sufficient number of days in the next month. Then up to and including the last day of the month. Okay, example, one calendar month from December 31, 2020 will be from January 1, 2021 to January 31, 2021. One calendar month from January 31, 2021 will be from February 1, 2021 until February 28, 2021. Clear? Okay, next. When obligation can be demanded before lapse of period? First, when debtor becomes insolvent. Tandaan nyo kailan ba pwede yung obligasyon? When obligation can be demanded before the lapse of period. So, sobra na naman. Typo error. When obligation, tanggalin na isang obligation. Pwede ba na mag-demand before the lapse of the period? Pwede. In 3 cases. When the debtor becomes insolvent. Ibig sabihin, pwede ka na maningil kahit pa umabot pa yung period. Kung ang iyong mangungutang ay naging insolvent o wala ng pambayad. That insolvent class is declared by court. So, mag-a-apply sa court yan, yung taong yan. Otherwise, kung hindi siya nag-apply, hindi siya insolvent. Tandaan nyo yun, A person cannot be declared insolvent if only the court can declare a person insolvent. When the guarantees or securities given have been impaired or have disappeared. Tandaan nyo, pag yung mga warranty, guarantee, or security, halimbawa, kumuha ka nangutang ka, tapos sinabi mo, sinong guarantor mo? O si Darwin nangutang, guarantor niya si Carlo, si Carlo nawawala. Okay, pwede na kitang singilin. Kasi wala nang guarantor, walang magagaranty sa iyo na babayaran mo. So, kahit dumating or before dumating yung lapse of period, pwede na ka nang singilin. Okay? Next, when the debtor attempts to abscond. Abscond means tumakas, umalis. So, pag yung debtor mo nag-attempt tumakas, then, pwede ka nang maningil. Attempt pa lang. Hindi nakaalis. No? Nag-attempt siyang tumakas, nahuli mo. So, the obligation can be demanded before the lapse of time. Okay, dito na tayo sa alternative and facultative obligations. Ano ba ibig sabihin ng alternative and facultative obligation? Pero bago yan, kailangan muna nating intindihan ano ba yung different kinds of obligation according to object. Pwedeng simple, when we speak of simple, there is only one prestation pag simple obligation. Pag sinabi mong compound obligation, one where there are two or more prestations. Okay? So, pwede siyang conjunctive, pwede siyang distributive. Okay? At kung siya ay distributive, pwede siyang alternative or facultative obligation. So, ganon ang pagtingin ng ating different kinds of obligation. Okay? So, ano ba yung conjunctive? Kasi sinabi natin yung compound, one where there are two or more prestations. Pag sinabi mong conjunctive, one where there are several prestations, all of them are due. Conjunctive, lahat due, tas marami. Okay? Pero pag sinabi mong distributive, one where two or more prestation is due, pwede ring alternative when one where several prestations are due but the performance of one is sufficient. Ibig sabihin, pag alternative, lahat siya due, pero pag pinerform yung isa, pwede na. Yun yung pwede na siya. Pero pag facultative, one where only one prestation is due but the debtor may substitute it for another. Okay? Pwede siyang paltan. So, yung alternative, marami. Nakalatag dyan. Piliin mo isa, okay na yung obligation. Facultative o ito. Pero pag hindi mo magawa ito, pwede pa ito. Merong kapalit or merong substitution. Okay? So, we focus on alternative and facultative obligations. When we speak of alternative is one wherein various prestations are due but the performance of one of them is sufficient as determined by choice, which is general rule, belongs to the debtor. Okay? Yan yung tatandaan nyo, ha? General rule, the right of choice is given to the debtor. But, bigyan muna natin ng example. Darwin borrowed from Carlo 10,000. It was agreed that Darwin could comply with his obligation by giving Carlo 10,000 or a colored television or by painting the house of Carlo. The delivery of the 10,000 or the colored TV set or the painting of the house is sufficient to comply with the obligation. Performance must be complete. Carlo cannot be compelled to accept. For instance, 5,000 and half of the television, hindi pa pwede yun. Isa lang pwede na. Hindi pa pwedeng hati-hati. Okay? So that is alternative obligation. As a general rule, the right to choose the prestation belongs to the debtor. And by way of exception, it may be exercised by the creditor, but only when expressly. Dapat express. Okay? Yan yung sinasabi natin. Right of choice of debtor, not absolute. Kasi pwedeng mag-express na granted sa creditor. Or, of course, by third person when the right is given to him by common agreement. Pwede yun. Sabi sa batas, that is Article 1306, and precisely expressly granted to the creditor, that is Article 1205. Yan natin ang example. Sam binds himself to deliver item 1 or item 2 to Berto on December 10 and to communicate his choice on or before December 5. If Sam delays in making his choice, Berto cannot exercise the right because it is not expressly granted to him. Dapat siya mismo ang pipili. Okay? Right of choice of debtor, hindi siya absolute. Gaya nga ng sabi natin, kung expressly siya, pwede sa creditor. Okay? The debtor cannot choose those prestations which are impossible, unlawful, and which could not have been the object of obligation. Remember, hindi pwedeng papiliin ang isang debtor din kung ito ay impossible or unlawful. The debtor has no more right of choice also when among the prestation whereby he is alternatively bound, only one is practicable. Natandaan nyo rin yan. Okay? Isa lang ang practicable. In this case, na yung obligation na limit na to simple obligation. Okay? Simple obligation na. So, na-limit na siya. Now, kahit anong dami ng prestation, pag nawala yung iba, it becomes a simple obligation. Pure and simple obligation. Communication of notice that choice has been made. It is important that the effect of notice must be communicated. Okay? And it remains alternative. One of the notice of election has been given to the creditor. The obligation ceases to be alternative and becomes simple. Pag na-communicate na natin. Ano yung proof and form of notice? The burden of proving that such communication has been made is upon whom made the choice. And that is usually the debtor. The law does not require, wala namang sinasabi ang batas of a particular form regarding the giving of notice. Ang mahalaga lang, nag-usap na. Among the prestation, sinasabi ko, ito ang pipiliin ko. Basta na-communicate mo ng maayos, then that is already communication of choice. Anong effect pag only one prestation is practicable? If more than one is practicable, of course, alternative, pwede ka mamili. Yun ang, pero, the obligation is still alternative because the debtor has still the right of choice. Pero pag isa lang ang practicable, the obligation is converted to a simple one. Parating yung tatandaan nyo, kahit anong dami, pero pag napili na, simple obligation na. Or, kung ang obligasyon ay marami, ano ba magandang example? Halimbawa, maraming obligasyon. A, bigyan ka ng kabayo. B, bumiyahe ka papuntang Hong Kong. C, bayaran ka ng 10,000. Namatay yung kabayo. So, hindi na. Dalawa na lang. Pumunta kang Hong Kong. Pandemic. Hindi ka nakapunta. So, it became a simple obligation. So, 10,000 pesos na lang. Yun ang ibig sabihin ng when only one prestation is practicable. When debtor may rescind contract. Kailan? Rescind means, ito yung kinakat mo na yung contract. The agreement, rescission, or you hereby pwede mong tapusin na yung kontrata. Okay? Tapusin na yung agreement. It is pag sinabi mo kasing rescission, it creates the obligation to return the things which were the object of the contract together with their fruits and the price with its interest. It is the very nature of an alternative obligation that the debtor can make his choice without the consent of the creditor. Hence, the right given to the debtor to rescind the contract and recover damages. If the creditor's fault, he cannot make a choice according to the terms of the obligation. The debtor, however, is not bound to rescind. Okay? Inasabi lang natin na yung right given to the debtor to rescind the contract and recover damages, if through the creditor's fault, he cannot make a choice according to the terms of the obligation. Okay? It is the very nature of an alternative obligation that the debtor can make his choice without the consent of the creditor. Kasi sa kanya yung choice, the power of choice is given to the debtor. Pero kung di siya mapili dahil may kasalanan ng then he may. Okay, he may rescind. He may rescind. Okay? What are the effects of loss of objects of obligation? Okay, what else? Some of the objects of the obligation have been lost or have become impossible even through the fault of the debtor, the latter is not liable since he has the right of choice of the obligation can still be performed. Halimbawa, pamili ka, aso, kabayo, o tigre. Nawala yung aso. Pwede pa rin siya mamili. Because, unang-una, meron pa siya pagpipilian. As long as meron kang pagpipilian, the debtor will always have a choice. The difference now is if all of the objects ay nawala, if all of them have been lost or become impossible through his fault, kasalanan ng debtor, the creditor shall have the right to indemnity for damages since the obligation can no longer be complied. Of course, if the cause of the loss is fortuitous, the obligation is extinguished. Yun yung mga titignan nyo, klase. Parating yung titignan. If yung mga object or prestation ay available pa, halimbawa, 3. Aso, kabayo, at tigre. Nawala yung 2. It is now simple obligation. Nawala yung 3. Ngayon, pwede nang humingi yung creditor ng magkano yung value plus damages. Kasi hindi naman pa-perform eh. 3 na ang nawala. So, paano mo pa ma-perform ang iyong obligation? Okay? Now, what else? We move to facultative obligation. Okay? Ano ba ibig sabihin ng facultative obligation? When we speak of facultative obligation, it is one where only one prestation has been agreed upon, but the obliger may render another in substitution. Okay? Isa lang ang napag-usapan, pero merong substitution. Example, I will give you my piano, but I may give you my LCD television set as a substitute. Simple. In this obligation, only the piano is due. Hence, its loss through my fault will make me liable to give you my LCD as a substitute. Okay? Now, para mas maintindihan nyo pang further, paano pag nawala, effect of loss before and after substitution. Before substitution, kung yung principal thing is lost through a fortuitous event, the obligation is extinguished. Otherwise, the debtor is liable for damages. Before substitution, the loss of the thing intended as a substitute with or without fault of the debtor does not render him liable. Okay? Basta walang kasalanan. Okay? With the loss of the thing intended as a substitute with or without fault of the debtor does not render him liable. Okay? The reason is that the thing intended as a substitute is not due. The effect of the loss is merely to extinguish the facultative character of the obligation. Okay? With or without fault. Wala namang kasalanan ng debtor. Anong nangyari? It becomes a simple and pure obligation. Nawala na yung facultative. Nawala na yung substitution part. Yun yung effect pag nawala ang isa sa mga prestation for substitution. Okay? Example, Sam will give Berto item 1 or if Sam wants item 2. If the item 1 is lost through fortuitous event, the obligation is extinguished. Okay? Item 1 is lost through the fault of Sam. Sam is liable for damages. Item 2 is lost with or without fault of Sam, then Sam is still liable to deliver item 1. He is not liable for damage for the loss of item 2 is not due. As it is not due. Okay? So, ibig sabihin lang nun, na wala fortuitous event. Wala nang what do you call this? There is no facultative obligation. Okay? So, extinguished na. Pero kung walang kasalanan at nawala, whether meron o wala, at nawala ang item 1, okay? What do you call this? Ang magagawa na lang ni Sam is he can deliver item number 2. Okay? He can deliver item number 1. Kasi nawala ni number 2. So, it becomes a simple or pure obligation. Now, after substitution, tapos na, nakapili na. Nakapili na si debtor. If the principal thing is lost, the debtor is not liable, whatever may be the cause of the loss, because it is no longer due. If the substitute is lost, the liability of the debtor depends upon whether or not the loss is due to his fault. Once substitution is made, the obligation is converted to simple one to deliver or perform the substituted thing or prestation. The substitution becomes effective from the time of its communication. Tandaan nyo, class, ha? After substitution, wala na. Simple obligation na. So, kung na-communicate na yun, then it is already liable. Then he is already liable. Okay? Now, let us distinguish alternative versus facultative. Number of prestations. Sa alternative, several prestations are due, but compliance with one is sufficient. On the other hand, sa facultative, only one prestation is due, although the debtor is allowed to substitute it. That is facultative. Right of choice, in the alternative, the right of choice may be given to the creditor or third person, while in the second, or the facultative, the right to make the substitute is given only to the debtor. Dahil yung right of choice, debtor lang yun. Loss through a fortuitous event. In alternative, the loss of one or more of the alternatives through a fortuitous event does not extinguish the obligation. Pero in the second, the loss of the thing due extinguishes the obligation. Okay, number 4. Loss through fault of debtor. Si debtor may kasalanan. In alternative, the loss of one of the alternatives through the fault of the debtor does not render him liable. While in the second, dun sa facultative, the loss of the thing due through his fault makes him liable. Sa alternative, where the choice belongs to the creditor, the loss of one of alternative through the fault of the debtor gives rise to liability. While in facultative, the loss of the substitute before the substitution through the fault of the debtor does not render him liable. Okay? Yan yung loss. Ang may kasalanan ay yung debtor. So, it's important for you to analyze every word. Okay? Any questions, you can message me through our private messenger. Watch out for the next video lecture. That is, ano ba yung susunod na video lecture natin? Of course, yung joint and solidary obligations, obligations with the penal clause, and divisible and indivisible obligations. Okay, thank you.